Hi, thank you again for coming back and joining us on Monday. Thank you especially to Paul for kindly rejoining us to do this seminar so that we can get it recorded for people to view later who cannot attend. So this is the first seminar of our seminar series of the 21-22 academic year, Erasing the Past, Monuments in Memory, Heritage, and History. And you might remember Paul, if you attended any of our seminars from last year, he led the one on the immigration debate through a historical perspective. And he's kindly joining us again, and we will be continuing these seminars into the spring semester. Some more information on those to follow. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Paul. He has taught history here at Fresno City College for 18 years, which includes US history, California, world history, as well as global issues and history of the civil rights movement. These seminars, as I mentioned, this is going to be recorded and posted to our YouTube site, our professional development YouTube site. And if you didn't attend or you did attend and want to revisit the seminars from last year, those are also posted on that YouTube site. So again, welcome back, and thank you again, Paul, for leading us through this.
Well, are we recording? Is that happening now officially and all that? I think so. As Nylene just said, I'm Paul Gilmore, and I teach history here. And so what I'm going to talk about today is going to include kind of a history lesson. Some of you were here on Friday, and I'm going to redo it a little bit, but I'll try not to do as much detail as I did on Friday. I get into this stuff so much that I kind of forget that I need to, pare it down and give us some time for question and answer. So those who were here on Friday, maybe you could afterwards tell me whether or not you think I succeeded. I'm going to share the screen. I've got a PowerPoint for you. And so let's see here, new share. Here we go. There we go. Erasing the Past, Monuments and Memory, Heritage and History. We historians love to have subtitles with our titles. In general, what the talk today is going to be about is Confederate monuments and the Confederate flag and other symbols of the Confederacy and the controversy over them in recent years. And that's why I've titled this Erasing the Past with a question mark. Because if there's one thing I think that people say to me when I talk to them about this, they ask that question, aren't we just erasing the past? Well, I'm going to return to that in a little bit here before we end the class, the question of whether or not we're erasing the past. But what I want to do is begin by talking about the controversy over these monuments, but also over the way we teach race, the way we teach the history of racism in American classrooms. And some of the well, I guess it's a controversy that comes up again and again throughout our history. How to not just the story of race and racism, but how to teach race and racism to our kids. And in recent years, the nation has really been engaged in debate over this, over how we remember the past, especially concerning the history of racism here in the United States. It's not just the story of race and racism, although this has been a major part of it. And of course, a flashpoint in those debates, going all the way back to the 1980s and 90s, but sort of accelerating in the last few years here, has been the official display of Confederate symbols, flags and statues and so on, commemorating the Civil War. And relatedly, in recent months, we've seen a kind of roiling, angry debate over the history curriculum. many of you may have seen in the news, a lot of the screaming heads on television news talking about CRT, talking about critical race theory, and how it's somehow, I mean, the complaint has been that it is somehow infecting or harming our K-12 history curriculum, that it's some kind of political interference in the way we teach kids, that we're teaching them propaganda and not history. Well, the thing that reignited that debate was this New York Times. Let me see if I've got to get my, there we go. This New York Times magazine piece put out in 2019 to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved Africans being brought to an English colony in mainland America. This New York Times magazine piece was a collaboration of lots of historians, led by, though, a journalist named Nikole Hannah-Jones, who really became a kind of lightning rod for all of this anger, well, support as well. It was called the 1619 Project. And then there's been, just came out the other day, just last week, a book-length version of this, an expansion of the 1619 Project to a 450-page book, not just a piece in the New York Times. But Nikole Hannah-Jones has become a kind of lightning rod for the anger over this, because some supposedly her work and the historians in this book work is considered to be too politically propagandistic, I guess. And in a way, it is a political document in the sense that all history is a political document. And we'll talk about that as we go through today, that there is no removing politics from history. There's no removing it. And I think that's an important point to raise here, especially when we talk about the history of race and racism. You see, what the 1619 Project does is it, on its own terms, the way Jones talks about this, the way the historians who are in the project talk about it, is that they're going to reframe the way we think of American history and recenter the story of race and racism in the building of the country, to show how race is not just a sin, I guess, of the American past, but that it's really deeply entwined, deeply in. It's a part of our laws and institutions. It's part of the American culture. That race and racism is that core, one of the core, I don't know, factors in shaping American life. And lots of people take offense to that basic idea. Frankly, it's not such an unusual or even controversial thing among college professor historians. This is stuff we've been talking about for 60 years now, but now it's beginning to move into this, into the general curriculum, and a lot of people are taking offense to it. And then they put it under this umbrella of critical race theory, CRT. This is something that I think other folks in this series are going to deal with later on in this class. I mean, in this series. So maybe I'll not talk too much about CRT. If you have a question about it at some point, critical race theory, we can maybe talk about it. Well, at the risk of oversimplifying the two sides in this debate over these things, and recognizing that there are always more than two sides, I think I could start by generally laying out the points of view that can be seen in the debates over Confederate monuments and the debates over the 1619 Project. One side here, as I've already kind of laid it out, says that attempts to remove statues and other monuments, Confederate memorials and so on, and attempts to change the curriculum to include stuff like the 1619 Project are actually attempts to erase history, that they are part of a political agenda, and that they are erasing history, or an even worse supposed crime, judging the past by the standards of today. And the notion here is that there's an agenda behind this, a political agenda to make white people feel guilty and innately bad. The other side of this argument argues that these efforts are not attempts to erase history at all, and they're not attempts to attack white people at all, but rather they are attempts to be clear and honest about the past and the present, and recognizing the way that racism has been central to who we have been as a country. You can imagine, obviously, this creates lots of tension, this kind of argument. Now, I have my own views on all of this stuff, and they'll probably become clear as I go over this stuff today. But let me just say that I think that a lot of this fight and the heat of this fight over history stems from a basic misunderstanding of what history is, or perhaps two different versions of what history is. On the one hand, we have an idea of well, I was going to show you this email that I have, but I'm going to skip the email, and I'm going to skip this law that's been proposed recently. There's been many anti-CRT laws proposed, and many complaints about the way history is taught. Let me just skip right ahead and talk about this idea of heritage versus history. I think this controversy and these two different sides, as they've been laid out here, come from the two different sides kind of talking past each other in a way. Each side has a different idea of what history education is, or at least should be about. And for me, I think laying it out as heritage versus history is a good way to begin to think about it. In K through 12 history, but also in college history and in general popular understandings of what history and a history education should do, I think sometimes people make mistakes. I mean, people mistake history for heritage, or heritage for history. That is, heritage is a kind of myth that we tell about the past. Our heritage is, when we talk about heritage, we're talking about building a story about the past that makes us feel good about ourselves. That is that we downplay the negative sides of history and play up, or sometimes even lie about the positive sides of history. And so, the kind of traditional story we all learned about Thanksgiving when we were little kids, the Thanksgiving meal where the Puritans and the Native Americans got together, and it was all, everybody singing Kumbaya and being all in harmony there. That kind of story is a heritage story of the past. The story of George Washington, maybe as a little kid, you heard the story of George Washington not being able to tell a lie. He chops down the cherry tree and all of that kind of stuff. That's a heritage version of the past. Now, those are little children versions of heritage, but I think as we move, as we get older and older, we don't totally abandon. I mean, we understand that the cherry tree story itself is kind of a lie. And so we abandon those stories, but we don't really abandon the idea that history should be about patriotism. History should be about making people love their country. And so there's a real nervousness, I think, of those who embrace the idea of history as heritage. There's a real nervousness that a truthful telling of history will defeat that sort of heritage purpose. It'll make people not love their country. Let me tell you, folks, I think we're all adults here and we can handle the actual truth, even if it's negative. So I noticed just now that we have okay. I thought there was a question in the chat, but no, I get it. So let me move on and let's begin to talk about these various controversies today concerning race and history, and in particular concerning the Confederate flags and Confederate monuments and so on. And of course, one of the big moments here was the Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville, Virginia. This is one of the moments that kind of touched off the latest round of history wars. The Robert E. Lee statue was slated to be removed, and there was a big protest in 2017 to try to keep it. And then following that, many communities and even states passed laws making it illegal to remove these statues. Meanwhile, other folks were pushing really hard to remove them as symbols of racism and so on. So as a way of introducing this controversy, as a way of trying to figure out this controversy a little bit, I'm going to do something that you might not like very much. And that is, I'm going to do a short history lesson, a lesson on Reconstruction. I talk about this in all the classes I teach that deal with U.S. history. I talk about it in my civil rights class and my history 11, the early U.S. history class. I talk about it as the first thing I talk about in my modern U.S. history class, Reconstruction. I think the story of Reconstruction, even more than the story of the Civil War, has a real bearing on the controversy today, on the question of these monuments, and on the question of the curriculum. How can we talk about U.S. history in an honest way at the K-12 level and at the college level? So let me talk about Reconstruction a little bit. I'm going to give you a quick and dirty beginning of the story instead of getting into all the real details about Lincoln and Johnson and all the major figures and so on. I'm going to try to talk about Reconstruction by first just talking about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So Reconstruction was this moment that happened right after the Civil War. Remember, the North fought against the South. The Southern states had left the country. They had, basically said, we're going to set up our own country called the Confederacy. A main reason why they had left was they feared that the Northerners would move to eliminate slavery, the expansion of slavery into the West, but even slavery in the states where it did exist. So they were nervous about that. And so they had left the Union. They had left the country for the Civil War. The North, under Abraham Lincoln, said, nope, we're not going to let you. And so 700,000 dead people later, we get an attempt to reconstruct the country. That is, the Southern states are going to, there's two major questions that Reconstruction asks. One, how are the Southern states as political entities, as individual states, going to rejoin the Union? How are they going to move back into Congress, let's say, elect their own state legislatures, but also elect members of Congress, members of the House of Representatives and the Senate? What role are they going to play? How are they going to do this? That was question number one. Question number two, which I think is even more important, is the question of how are you going to socially and economically reconstruct the South? How are you going to rebuild this? The South has been destroyed. How are you going to rebuild it socially and economically? Especially considering that in the time of the Civil War, African Americans in the South had been freed from slavery. 4 million people freed from slavery. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are the national government's attempts to sort of lay out a basic reconstruction of the South, politically and socially and economically, frankly. I mean, those two questions are kind of being answered by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Now, let me just say this right now, before I get into what they are. Almost none of the laws that are passed by Congress that sort of set up Reconstruction, none of those laws were supported by the Democrats. This is all Republicans doing this. The attempt to try to free the slaves, the attempt to protect their civil rights, the attempt to get them the right to vote, all three of those things are Republican things. They are done by the Republican Party in the late 19th century. I'll get to this a little bit later too, because it always seems weird to my students. You know, it's like they're like, wait a minute, the Republicans are doing all this stuff. I mean, don't most African Americans today vote for the Democrats? Wasn't Barack Obama a Democrat? Well, yes, that's true. But back in the late 19th century, the Democrats were not in favor of these kinds of things. So let's talk about it. Okay, what was the 13th Amendment? Well, the 13th Amendment was this. Here it is. Excuse me. The 13th Amendment is basically an end to slavery. No more slavery is allowed except in these tiny cases, you know, supposedly tiny cases of punishment for a crime. So you can, if you've been convicted of a crime, you can be punished by being forced to labor. Otherwise, no slavery allowed anywhere. Notice when this was ratified. I mean, it was passed by Congress while the Civil War was still going on, and it's ratified by the end of 1865, December 6th, 1865. Now, you don't have to be, if the way we ratify amendments to the Constitution is Congress passes them, and then 3/4 of the states have to ratify them, have to say yes to them. Now, that means that some states don't ratify the 13th Amendment. They still have to obey it, but they never got around to ratifying it. The last state to finally get around to ratifying the 13th Amendment as a kind of symbolic thing was Mississippi. Mississippi was the last to officially ratify the 13th Amendment. And I always freak out my students when I tell them that it was ratified on March 16th, 1995. That's not a typo. So 130 years later, Mississippi finally gets around to ratifying it. And actually, officially, they didn't ratify it until February 7th of 2013, because they had forgot to send it up to the federal government to register it. So really, it's just a few years ago that Mississippi finally said, yeah, we're against slavery. I mean, I'm laughing instead of crying here. Now, the reason why I bring this up is to point out something, to point out the vast gap in time we have between the time of the end of slavery and the time that Mississippi says, yeah, we agree with that. Now, why is there this huge gap in time? Well, any historian should look at that and see some glaring questions. Number one, you might ask, well, why is it that if Mississippi is a democracy, if Mississippi is a democracy and over half of the people who live in Mississippi from the 1860s all the way up into the 1940s were African American, Mississippi was a majority Black state for a good portion of that time, you would think that if Mississippi is a democracy, it would pass the 13th Amendment. You know, it would ratify it. It should give us pause. We might actually start with the assumption that I mentioned just a moment ago. If Mississippi was a democracy, well, it's clear that at least for most of this time, Mississippi is not anything like a democracy. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. So we have an end to slavery, but what about civil rights? What about basic rights for people? Almost automatically, the Southern states tried to pass laws restricting Black people's movements, their right to own guns, their right to testify, to serve on juries, and so on. They said, okay, you're no longer enslaved, but you're not totally free either. We're going to try to make you as close to slaves as we possibly can. The white-run governments of the South did this right away. Congress, run by those Northern Republicans, looked at that and said, no, 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 you can't do that. They said to the Southern white folks, they said, you can't do that. And they passed a Civil Rights Act. This was one of their efforts to protect the civil rights of the formerly enslaved population of the South. So we get a Civil Rights Act that's passed in 1866. And then Congress in 1867 begins a military occupation of the South. They say, well, we're not going to withdraw the Union troops. We're going to have the military help protect the rights of Black people in the South from attempts by white folks to take away those rights. And they do more than pass the Civil Rights Act. They pass the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution puts in the Constitution this idea that you have to treat people equally. There was a question that had been raised. Well, are Black people, former slaves, but also free folks who had been free Black folks, are they citizens of the United States? Well, the 14th Amendment settles that question once and for all, right? All persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and of the state where they reside. So you're a citizen of the United States and a citizen of, say, Alabama. And Alabama cannot pass any laws which take away your rights as a citizen of the United States. And it can't deprive you of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. You see, all these Southern states had tried to pass laws saying, we want to treat Black and white people unequally. And the 14th Amendment said, you can't do that. Okay. This is incredibly important, the 14th Amendment. All right, well, what's the third one that gets passed? What about well, that one deals with the vote. You see, the 14th Amendment and the 13th Amendment, 13th Amendment, no more slavery, 14th Amendment, equal protection of the laws. But the 15th Amendment is the thing that's going to actually deal with the vote. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States, not by the national government, nor by any state, like Alabama or Mississippi. That's who we're looking at here, on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In other words, you cannot pass a law that says Black people don't get to vote, right? Or former slaves don't get to vote. You can't pass a law to do that. There is a loophole in this, and we'll get to that in a minute, but there's a huge loophole in this. I mean, if you wanted to pass an amendment to the Constitution that gives everyone the right to vote, you would write it in an affirmative way. You would say the right of citizens, all citizens have the right to vote, or all citizens over the age of 21 have the right to vote. Instead, the way they wrote this was in this negative way. You can't deny the right to vote based on these three things, but you can deny the right to vote based on pretty much anything else. So there's a big loophole there, something I'll come back to again. I'll come back to that in just a moment. Overall, though, if you think about it, this is pretty impressive. The Republicans in Congress, right after the Civil War, showed a real commitment to defending the rights of formerly enslaved people in the South. It was the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were really, truly a new promise of freedom and democracy for Black people. I mean, you read the words of those amendments, and they're pretty darn good. I think the 14th Amendment probably wouldn't even be passed today. I mean, it's a radical statement of equality, saying we got to treat people equally. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing, I think. But here's the thing. What happened on the ground in the South? This is the second part of the story. Okay, we've passed these laws, and Congress has passed these laws. Are they enforced? How are they interpreted? How does the story of the South fit into this? Well, at first, what we see is an enormous outpouring of support by Black folks in the South and some white allies for Black political participation. Huge numbers of African Americans went and voted in the South. They served at the local level. They served at the state level. They served at the national level as members of Congress. And the picture here that you see is Frederick Douglass in the middle, and then the first two Black senators in all of American history, Blanche Bruce and Hiram Revels. From where? Mississippi. Mississippi. These two guys served in the late 1860s and early 70s. Now, again, kind of like Mississippi being the last state to ratify the 13th Amendment, taking 130 years to do it, let's think about the number of African-American senators since these two men, since Bruce and Revels. So in the 1860s and 70s, Mississippi elects the first two African-American senators. The next senator, the next Black senator, is elected from Massachusetts in the 1960s. And then the rest of the senators, the rest of the African-American senators in all of American history have been elected since the 1990s. Here are all of the African-American senators in all of American history. Edward Brooke was the guy elected in the 60s. Then Carol Moseley Braun from Illinois, and Barack Obama replaced her, and Roland Burris replaced him when he became president. So Barack Obama was the fifth African-American senator in all of American history, and he's the first African-American president. Notice then we get Tim Scott, then William Cohen, Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, and now Raphael Warnock, who was elected last year. This is it. This is the whole thing. Again, the question should come up. Well, what happened? What happened to create this vast gulf of time between the 1860s and the 1960s? Well, what happened was what Southern white people called redemption of the South. Redemption. Southern white folks didn't take the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments lying down. They didn't just accept that it was now the law of the land. They didn't accept the other acts passed by the Republican Congresses to rebuild the South with some semblance of equality. They didn't accept those things. They fought back against those things. And they fought back with a massive campaign of terror against Black people and their white allies. This is an anti-KKK political cartoon from the era by Thomas Nast. But you got on either side of this poor African-American family being terrorized, you've got the KKK and the White League. Well, the KKK, I'm sure you've all heard of. It's the most famous terrorist group in American history. It rose up to take away the rights of Black people, to terrorize them away from voting, from asserting their rights to equal treatment, and so on. But it was more than the KKK. There was the White League, there were rifle clubs, there was a group called the Red Shirts, another one called the Black Shirts. There were several different terrorist groups all throughout the South engaged in doing this. Later on, they called this redeeming the South. That's why I have redemption there. Notice that redemption is in quotes. The way the white South saw this was that they were bringing that the South was brought low by the Republican policies of Reconstruction in the 1860s and 70s, and that their job as white people was to redeem the South by reasserting white supremacy, white rule of the South, by making sure that Black people were put, quote, back in their place. They called that redeeming the South. That white people deserve to rule and therefore should. One example of the extent of the terror campaign here is this: 1868 in Louisiana. Now, folks, just so you know, this happened throughout. This is Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Florida, North Carolina. You could tell the same basic story throughout the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and 1890s. But in Louisiana alone, in 1868, during the election season, from April until November, Democrats killed 1,081 people. 1,081 people. The Civil War is over. And yet they kill all of these folks. Almost all of the people they killed were Black. The white people that they killed were white people who had formed alliances with Black people in the Republican Party. But this was a straight out terror campaign. Another example can be seen in the Colfax Massacre of 1873. Now, the Colfax Massacre, again, is one of many, but it's going to become important because of a Supreme Court case. Now, what happened in the Colfax Massacre? Well, it starts in 1872. In 1872, there was an election in Louisiana, in Colfax Parish, basically a county election. And when you have the county election, you're electing the sheriff, the clerk, a justice of the peace, all of these kinds of offices. Well, the Republicans had won that election. Black people voted in that election, taking their lives into their own hands by doing so, but they did it. They voted. The Republicans won the election, and so they won all the major offices. And then in 1873, they go to the courthouse and they move into their offices. The white population of Colfax was so upset about this that they formed a vigilante mob that surrounded that courthouse. They brought all their guns and surrounded the courthouse. They brought up an old cannon from the Civil War. Then they began to fire upon the courthouse. The defenders in the courthouse shot back for a little bit, as you can imagine. But once, and 3 people were killed. But once the mob outside the courthouse set fire to the courthouse, it was clear that the people inside would have to surrender. And so these Republicans, almost all Black people, actually by this time, all the white folks inside the courthouse, all the white Republicans abandoned the defense. And so it was only Black Republicans left. They surrendered. They left the courthouse, surrendered to the white mob outside, and the leaders of that white mob proceeded to murder every single one of them. They executed them. Then that white mob went to the surrounding countryside and murdered another 100 to 150 African Americans, whoever they could find. This is a straight out massacre. Now, I mentioned that these things happened throughout the South, Mississippi, South Carolina, not usually as big as the Colfax Massacre, but they happened elsewhere too. The reason why I told you about this one is because the people who actually were in charge of that white mob of Democrats who ended up killing all of those Black people, those folks, the leaders, were actually tried and convicted for violating the civil rights of Black people. Basically, the idea was, well, we'll bring charges against you under the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. You've denied their right to vote. You've denied their civil rights. Certainly have denied their civil rights, right? I mean, you've murdered them. That was at least the argument. Well, they win. They win convictions of the folks who actually perpetrated this massacre. Now, what happens though? Well, this gets appealed and it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And it's a not very famous case called the United States versus Cruikshank, 1876. And in this case, in 1876, the Supreme Court said, yeah, those convictions of these leaders of this massacre, those convictions are now overturned. You had no right to charge them for violating the 14th and 15th Amendments. That's because the due process and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment apply only to the actions of states, not individuals. And since this was a mob of individuals who proceeded to murder the government of Colfax, Louisiana, then they have to be tried by the state of Louisiana. Now, the absurdity to this, I hope, comes completely clear here. The absurdity of it, of course, is that the actual perpetrators of the massacre are now the government of the state of Louisiana. You think they're going to put themselves on trial? I mean, this is insane. So the idea of the 14th Amendment not being able to protect African Americans from a straight out massacre is an important one, I think. This is a really important point, because if you have a 14th Amendment that can't protect you from literal execution in the middle of the street, then it's not a very useful 14th Amendment. I would argue that with a Supreme Court that interprets it this way, the 14th Amendment is going to do very little protecting of African American civil rights. Right around the same time, there was what was called the Compromise of 1877. This is the moment, and I won't get into all the details of it, but let me just put it this way. In the end, what this signaled was the Republican Party kind of washing their hands of the South. They're saying, all right, we're kind of done with Reconstruction. We'll pull out the last remaining troops that are in the South, protecting Black people's rights. It was a controversy over who had actually won the election, and the Republicans basically make this deal with the Democrats in order to keep the presidency for 4 more years. So Hayes became president, keeping the presidency in Republican hands, but in return, the Republicans are going to end Reconstruction in the South. So now that means Black folks in the South are kind of left to defend, they're left alone to defend themselves against these, frankly, marauding bands of white people trying to murder them for asserting their rights to vote and so on. Meanwhile, white Democrats take over the South. They take over all the governments of the South, so that by the 1880s, we don't see any more Republican victories in the South, or we see, I should say, very few Republican victories in elections in the South. It becomes a totally Democratic region and a white supremacist region. This is, by the way, a picture of an early KKK uniform. I put it up here because it looks even stupider than the ones they wear today. So I figured it'd be a good moment to laugh at these terrorists for a moment. The idea here was they were going to restore this system of white supremacy through a campaign of terror, yes, but then move on beyond terror to, once they get control of the governments, to pass laws that would take away the right to vote of Black people. Now, remember, we've got a 15th Amendment that says you can't deny the right to vote based on color, race, or previous condition of servitude. Well, they get around that. How do they get around that? Well, the white governments of the South know that Black people are typically very poor. And so they pass poll taxes and say, if you haven't paid your poll tax, you can't vote. And then they know that African Americans in the South often don't have very good education, or any education at all, can't read or write. And so they passed laws saying you have to be able to read in order to vote. Now, lots of poor white folks couldn't read either. And so they passed laws saying that if your grandfather could vote, you can vote, or rather, you don't have to take the literacy test. So that means that white people are kind of excluded from the literacy test while all Black people have to take it. But notice they don't mention Blackness. They don't mention race in these laws. Everybody knows that it's about taking away the right to vote of Black people, but they don't say we're taking away the right to vote of Black people. They say we're taking away illiterate people's right to vote. We're taking away desperately poor people's right to vote. If you don't own any property, you shouldn't have a say over government. But everybody knows that this is about disenfranchising Black people. I mean, the slogan of the Democratic Party at the time, here you are, here it is right here. This is a poster of the era. This is a white man's country, let white men rule. All right. Once the Democrats, the white supremacist Democrats, really secured power in the South, they passed all those laws disenfranchising, taking away the vote of Black people. Then they also passed laws segregating white and Black people. This too was challenged under the 14th Amendment. Hey, wait a minute, you're segregating us. Isn't that a violation of equal protection of the laws? Well, this too goes to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rules, no, it's not. It's perfectly fine to have segregation. It's perfectly fine to set up a system of Jim Crow apartheid in the South, so long as the facilities that are being segregated are separate but equal. You probably remember that from high school or college history class, separate but equal. This is Plessy versus Ferguson. Well, this is absurd. Obviously, the whole point of Jim Crow, the whole point of segregation is to tell Black people they are inferior to white people. That's the whole point. Yet the Supreme Court says it's okay. And so now the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment are pretty much gone. Well, what about the 13th Amendment? No more slavery. Well, I suppose no more slavery, yeah. But all sorts of laws are passed requiring African Americans especially to show proof of employment. To show proof of employment if they are walking down the street. Otherwise, you're a vagrant. And you can be arrested for vagrancy. In other words, the crime of being poor or unemployed. And once you're arrested for vagrancy, you then get convicted of a crime and thrown in jail and are then leased out to the former master to pick the cotton, to build the roads, to build the railroads, to work the brick factory of Atlanta, Georgia, to work in the coal mines of Birmingham, Alabama. Convict labor becomes a major part of the labor force of all of these southern states. Industrial labor force of northern Alabama, the woodworking labor force of the piney woods of Louisiana and southern Alabama, and so on. The builders of railroads in Georgia and Florida. Convict labor. So what am I saying here? Well, I'm saying that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, though they were incredible promises of freedom for African Americans, that by the 1890s, they don't really count at all. The 13th Amendment still is pretty much enforced, except through this huge loophole that I'm showing you pictures of here. The 14th and 15th Amendments, you can pretty much just count out. They don't count at all. Black people can't vote in the South in the 1890s and early 1900s, not really until the 1960s are they able to freely vote in America. Black people can't expect equal protection of the laws, thanks to the gutting of the 14th Amendment. So, okay, now I've done it. I've gone here and I've done what I wasn't going to do, which was I've talked too long about Reconstruction. So why in the world did I give you this whole history lesson on Reconstruction when we're supposed to be talking about commemorations of the Civil War? Well, because almost right away, a kind of political debate over history began right after the Civil War, but especially in the early 1900s. I love this little quote here. This is, I think, a really great quote from George Orwell from the book 1984, and it gets at the politics of history, the struggle over what we talk about as historians. And I love the line because it just says it straightforward. Who controls the past controls the future. And who controls the present controls the past. What this quote is, if you remember from 1984, if you ever read that book, the main character in that book is a guy named Winston. And his job in this totalitarian society is to erase parts of history that are inconvenient to the rulers of the present. Now, it's really ham-fisted in 1984. He literally cuts it out and cuts the pieces out of newspapers and throws them down this thing called a memory hole, where it burns all the evidence of the past, and then he fakes new evidence that might be more useful to those who rule in the present. Well, the United States isn't a totalitarian society. It isn't this dictatorship like 1984 or something, but we do have a similar situation, right? Those who control the present control what the kids learn about the past. Those who control the present control the past. And if you grow up learning about the past in a certain way, then nobody has to force you to obey in the future, because you've been taught that your obedience is only rational, only normal. The way the world works is the way it has always been. If you've been taught that way, then that's the way you're going to act in the future. So how do we apply this to the story of these Confederate monuments and so on? Well, let's ask the question: how did historians of the early 20th century tell the story that I just went over? How did they do it? What did they write about the past? Well, almost right away, historians talked about the Civil War as a lost cause. That is, that it was this noble cause for states' rights. That's what they began to say. The Civil War wasn't about slavery. It was a lost cause where these Southerners wanted to defend the great principle of states' rights, to manage their own affairs, and that they were defeated in this noble lost cause. And so that became the general idea of the history of the Civil War. The history of Reconstruction was basically the story that the South was redeemed. Reconstruction was this awful, terrible mistake, so said almost every major historian. It was this terrible mistake where Black people were given too much political power when they were not able to wield it because they were inferior people. And that Southern white people redeemed the South. They brought it back from its low point to a higher point by making sure that white folks ruled in the South. There's a whole school of thought among historians called the Dunning School. Here's a slide of the Lost Cause. Came out right away, 1866. We're going to rewrite the history of the South in a way that makes the Confederacy look like a noble thing, even though they lost, right? But the Dunning School of Reconstruction, this is William Dunning from Columbia University, not at all a Southern university. And basically, he lays out this idea that yes, the Southern governments were incredibly corrupt, that white people had to reestablish white supremacy to create useful governments again. They redeemed the South. Here's an example. I'll give you an example of Dunning School history right here. Just really quick, let me read this quote. He's talking. This historian is talking about about Reconstruction, and see how different this story, the way it's told in this quote, see how different that is than the way I just told it. Here it is. Adventurers swarmed out of the north, as much the enemies of the one race as of the other. He's talking about white people from the north going south. They swarmed out of the north to cozen, beguile, and use the Negroes. In the villages, the Negroes were the office holders, men who knew nothing of the uses of authority except its insolences. The policy of the congressional leaders wrought a veritable overthrow of civilization in the South. That is, Black people voting and being in government positions was a veritable overthrow of civilization in the South in their determination to put the white South under the heel of the Black South. The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. Now, let that sink in for a moment. This was a very popular history written in the early 1900s about the South, and basically saying that the KKK were heroes. Right? They're just protecting the Southern country from these ignorant Black people. Now, who was the author of the book that says this? Well, Woodrow Wilson. I put his picture up there. I mean, he becomes president. He's one of the most loved presidents in American history. He's president from 1913 to 1921, basically. I put him up there, though, to show you how normal such ideas were in the early 20th century. This was the normal way of thinking of it, because who controls the present? Well, these white supremacists control the present, and so they control our understanding of the past by right. I mean, he's not just some whack job. he's a president of Princeton University, and then president of the United States, our first history professor president. Lots of other folks in the early 20th century would do these kinds of pageants, blue-gray pageants of reconciliation between old veterans of the Civil War, between the North and the South, and they'd hand back the battle flags. And so the Confederate flag became an important symbol of racial reconciliation. And what I mean by racial reconciliation is the white people of the South reconciling with the white people of the North, but on the backs of the Black people of the South and the Black people of the North. And it's at this time, this is when people built all of those monuments. The monument to General Lee, the monuments all over Tennessee to Nathan Bedford Forrest, famous for raising the Black flag and attacking Fort Pillow and killing all the Black people at Fort Pillow after the surrender, just murdering them. This is Nathan Bedford Forrest, a guy who has more monuments to him in Tennessee than anybody else. All through that era, we see these monuments go up. There's some 1,500 symbols of the Confederacy in public spaces. 1,500 of these get built, and you get a sense of that here in this laying it out there. 718 monuments and statues, 109 public schools, and so on and so forth. This doesn't include waving the Confederate flag. In many places, the Confederate flag was raised on state houses or county or local courthouses and so on. Here's a map of all of that stuff. You can barely read what it, the key down there, the legend down there, but this is it. All the different colors stand for, all the different symbols stand for different things, right? Parks, trails, monuments, buildings, flags are on this one. You get a sense of it here. Let me show you though when these things were built. I ran across this a few years ago when the real controversy developed again, but it's a nice little timeline. You see, most of the building of these monuments, that most of these commemorations, don't happen right after the Civil War, and they don't happen even during Reconstruction. They happen at the end of Reconstruction. In other words, you see this real monument building kind of flurry in the early 1900s. In other words, this was once Southern governments were fully taken over by white supremacists. Those white supremacists then turned around and built this landscape of memory, this way of remembering the past that was purposefully a middle finger to Black people. These are monuments of triumphalism. We may have lost the Civil War, but we won Reconstruction. And we're going to prove it by putting these statues up on every courthouse in the land. Notice that there's that time period where you see the vast majority of these things being built during what they call the nadir, the real low point of race relations in American history. This incredibly vicious time when you see huge numbers of lynchings going on against Black people, not just in the South, but mainly in the South, in the early 1900s. That's when you see these memorials and statues go up. There's a second period here where you see a kind of resurgence of these memorials going up, and that is during the Civil Rights Movement. It really accelerates right after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Brown versus Board of Education, they overturned Plessy versus Ferguson and began to say, we're going to enforce the 14th Amendment. We're going to enforce the 14th Amendment now. And it was a school integration case. And notice all the green dots there. Those green dots are the renaming of schools after Confederate heroes. Notice in the previous one, there's very few green dots. They don't name too many schools after Confederate heroes. No, they wait until Black people get access to the public school system and through integration, and now they're going to name all these. They're going to change the names of all these schools. In other words, these Confederate memorials are not really about the Civil War. They're about the subjugation of Black people, a celebration of the subjugation of Black people. And they knew, and they figured it this way at the time. It's really not until the 1890s that those white supremacists in the South really secured power over all the governments of the South. And so it's in the 1890s that you see them really begin to build these statues and then accelerate in the early 1900s. This is the unveiling of the largest one there was in Richmond, Virginia in 1890. It was just taken down in recent months. Here's a more typical one. They're much smaller usually. This is Confederate veteran Wiley Nash talking about the Lexington, Mississippi monument. This is what was said at the time that the monument was built. Here it is. These Confederate monuments, these sacred memorials, tell in silent but potent language that the white people of the South shall rule and govern the Southern states forever. That's a clear statement that this is a middle finger to Black people. It's a reminder that white folks won. Here's another one, Mutton Park in Lakeland, Florida. Most of these were financed, or at least begun the process of financing by the Daughters of the Confederacy. Very often, city, county, state money was involved. But it was a public and private kind of agreement to build these things on courthouse lawns. I'm showing you this one in Lakeland, Florida, because this is where my wife is from, and we've been down there and seen that monument before. Here's the Confederate Memorial in Arlington Cemetery, the National Cemetery. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the only African-American historians at this time, one of the greatest historians we've ever had, wrote a book that most historians at the time kind of rolled their eyes at, but one that was, I would say, much more attentive to the historical record than anything that was being written at the time, any of that redemption narrative kind of reconstruction story. Notice what he says here. The most terrible thing about war, I'm convinced, is its monuments, the awful things we are compelled to build in order to remember the victims. In the South, particularly, human ingenuity has been put to it to explain on its war monuments the Confederacy. Of course, the plain truth of the matter would be an inscription something like this: sacred to the memory of those who fought to perpetuate human slavery. But that reads with increasing difficulty as time goes on. It does, however, seem to be overdoing the matter to read on a North Carolina Confederate monument, died fighting for liberty. Talk about a rewriting of history, an erasing of the history of a war fought for slavery. That's what these monuments, to me at least, are. I'm giving you my views now, aren't I? Several of these monuments, most insultingly, were built to the so-called faithful slaves, these folks who remained faithful to their masters. Here's a plaque in North Carolina. Here's another one to the faithful slaves at Harper's Ferry, to this guy, Hayward Shepherd, who wasn't even enslaved. He was a free man, and it was put up there, though. Here's a faithful slave monument in Rhode Island, of all places. And even the Confederate Memorial in Arlington Cemetery has a picture of the faithful slave. There she is. There's a white soldier heading off to war, and she's handing over his baby for a last kiss, and she's got a tear rolling down her cheek there. The faithful slave monument. How about that Colfax massacre that I told you about? How was it remembered? Well, there was a monument to it too. Here it is. It's a little one. It's not very big. What does it say? It says, I don't know if you can read it there. You probably can't, but it says, erected to the memories of the heroes, Stephen Decatur Parrish, James West Hadnot, and Sidney Harris, who fell in the Colfax riot fighting for white supremacy, April 13th, 1873. The three white people who were killed before the surrender, the three white people who were killed in the kind of melee that happened when that white mob came to the elected government and the elected government was defending itself and they were having a kind of shootout. So the three white people who were killed get memorialized here as they were fighting for white supremacy. This isn't some slogan that people say today. They literally talked about it at the time in this way, and they saw it as a good thing. We're going to build white supremacy here. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Here's a more recent memorial of the same moment, the Colfax riot. It's a history marker, but notice what it says. On this site occurred the Colfax riot. I love the idea that this is a riot, folks. This is not a riot, it's murder. It's a straight out massacre. At least here they say the numbers correctly, or somewhat correctly, in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. At least they're mentioning that 150 Black people were murdered. But notice they say were slain, the passive voice, right? We know who did it, but of course they were just slain. This event on April 13th, 1873, marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. Carpetbag, in other words, these northern folks coming down south to rule over the South. So in other words, this is still a redemption narrative. Even though this happened where 150 Negroes, quote, were slain, it was a good thing because it ended carpetbag misrule of the South. I like it when people edit these things. So some people have asked the question, all right, what do we do? Do we recontextualize these monuments? Do we take them down? Do we move them to a museum? I'll leave it to you to decide. Personally, I think we should take them down. What to do with a heritage that covers up or ignores or even celebrates a history of racism? I say we remove them. I don't think it erases history to remove things that aren't historical at all. On the other hand, they do tell us a lot about the history, not of the Civil War, not of Reconstruction, but of white Southerners in the early 20th century. And there's a little bit of an attempt here in Mississippi. This is an attempt to sort of recontextualize one. At the very end of it, it says, this historic statue is a reminder of the university's divisive past. Today, the University of Mississippi draws from that past and a continuing commitment to open its hallowed halls to all. In other words, we're not segregating anymore. So they're trying to sort of suggest that this was a site of defense against integration, and that we are re-understanding that now. Well, what happened to this one? Well, this one in Charlottesville, Virginia, was taken down. But I think sometimes those who defend these monuments know more, it seems, about what they really symbolize than those than most other folks. I mean, why in the world did this Unite the Right racist rally occur at that statue? Why was it such a symbol of resistance to a multicultural, multiracial America to them? I think it's because they knew what the history of the Confederacy really is. It's a history of racism. You know, the Confederate flag, and when you see that bumper sticker, heritage, not hate, it is a heritage of hate. There's a Nathan. Yes.
We do have a question if you want to take it now.
Good.
Okay.
Yes. This is perfect timing because we're finishing up here. Okay. Go ahead. What's the question?
With this trend towards eliminating or replacing Confederate monuments, what do you think will happen with Civil War reenactments? Will we begin to see a diminishment of those events?
You know, I don't know. I think sometimes I think Civil War reenactments are very often come out of the same sort of impulse, the idea of turning history into heritage. And so I always struggle with those Civil War reenactments. People say, well, at least they learn something about history there. And, you know, the way I look at it is, yeah, okay, they learn something about history. They learn, you know, they learn about the size of the rifles that were used. They learn about the style of buttons that somebody put on their uniform. They learn all of this kind of trivial bit of history. And then the larger stories, I think, especially the story of race and racism, gets pushed to the side when we do that. My guess is we'll see less and less of it. There's a great book on this called Confederates in the Attic, about the whole sort of cultural milieu around reenactments, war reenactments. You can see my view of it already, the way I'm talking about it. Lots of historians love these things. I'm not a fan. I see them as akin to some of this, but perhaps more valuable. In other words, a Confederate reenactment can be, you know, focused on accuracy, which is good, as opposed to a celebration or a commemoration of a kind of false narrative of history, which these monuments are. And I think these monuments are much more intended as a celebration of what we recognize today as a false history, whereas the reenactments at least have some commitment to accuracy. So does that answer the question there, do you think?
I think it does. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
Not right now.
So here's Munn Park again. I was there a few years ago, right around the time that they were talking about removing it. There's a big defense rally that was happening. They wanted to make sure that this Confederate monument would stay. Here's a picture of one of the guys, defending it. In the end, they removed it. That's a picture of the circle now. I love that one. That's a really good one. Nice picture. University of North Carolina had a big, huge effort to remove their statue. I mean, it went on for years and finally was toppled on August 21st, 2018. There's a picture of it. I've been talking about quotes a bit. Here's the taking down of another monument. And here's the woman who did it being arrested, Takia Thompson. I think this one was I forget where this one is all of a sudden. But I love this quote. The struggle of humanity against oppression is the struggle of memory against forgetting. Now that's a quote by Milan Kundera, who was a novelist in the Eastern Bloc in the 1980s. I think he's in Czechoslovakia. And so what he is talking about is the memory of Czechs in the face of the power of the USSR, of this communist totalitarian society. But for me at least, this is a very useful quote for us. The struggle of humanity against oppression is the struggle of memory against forgetting. And it might seem almost counterintuitive that tearing down a statue would be an example of memory fighting against forgetting. But I think that's what it is. You see, to me at least, those statues are monuments to forgetting. They're monuments to amnesia. They're monuments to an idea that Reconstruction never happened, or that the Reconstruction that did happen was this terrible, awful mistake, instead of this great and honorable moment in American history where Black people were able, with some white allies, were able to defend their rights for at least a little bit, where we had a chance to create a society that was multiracial and equal, and yet blew that chance. That's the memory that's being recovered by tearing down those statues. So the struggle of memory against forgetting includes tearing down these Confederate statues, just as people back in the 1980s and early 90s, people like Milan Kundera tore down the statues of Stalin and Lenin in Czechoslovakia. That wasn't an erasure of history. It was a remembrance of the real history of resistance that had occurred during that time. The monuments themselves were the erasure of the real history. And so anyway, I see Takia Thompson here as a great historian in a way, somebody who's trying to engage in a little bit of memory recovery. Let me tell you, folks, these monuments are still sites of political fights. This is a historical monument, a historical marker of where Emmett Till, the young African-American boy, was murdered and thrown into a river in 1955. And it became a world famous case. And these are some guys from Ole Miss fraternity taking shots at it. It was a favorite target practice for white people, not 100 years ago, but 5 years ago. They had to literally put in a bulletproof historical marker. These are real fights, real fights. Let me ask, does anybody else have another question?
There aren't any yet.
Okay. Now, somebody might have a question, and let me quickly go over this. Somebody might have a question that says, well, wait a minute, let's talk about more than African Americans. What other kinds of myth making goes on? And I think a major element of myth making that goes on is the way we tell the story of Native Americans as well, and the way we memorialize that history. And I think it's a parallel story of coming up with a heritage that erases the history of Native Americans, erases them from our present and erases them from the past, or puts them in the past in a way that sees them as merely an obstacle to overcome by white people. And so that story, I think, is also an important one. And also it has its books that by historians, famous historians who celebrate the Native American, the attempted genocide of Native Americans. I'll give you an example if we've got 5 minutes. Do we have 5 minutes?
Yes, you have 7.
Okay, all right, cool. I don't want to take too much of people's time, but yeah, here's a book from 1889, The Winning of the West. And, I know the print is very, very small. It starts out with, no other conquering and colonizing nation has ever treated the original savage owners of the soil with such generosity as has the United States. That's quite a statement. And let me get to the big stuff. Most fortunately, the hard, energetic, practical men who do the rough pioneer work of civilization in barbarous lands are not prone to false sentimentality. The most ultimately righteous of all wars is a war with savages, though it's apt to be also the most terrible and inhuman. The rude, fierce settler who drives the savage from the land lays all civilized mankind under a debt to him. It is of incalculable importance that America, Australia, and Siberia should pass out of the hands of their red, black, and yellow Aboriginal owners and become the heritage of the dominant world races. Who said this? Who wrote this in this best-selling book called Winning of the West of 1889? Well, we dealt with Woodrow Wilson before. Let's go with the president right before him. Teddy Roosevelt wrote it. And then we put his face on a sacred mountain in Dakota, in Sioux territory in South Dakota called Mount Rushmore. Talk about a triumphalist middle finger. A celebration of genocide. We see it everywhere, though. I would spend some time talking about the progress of civilization erected in 1863 on the capital of the United States. But let me just cut to the chase here. It presented progress as a story of Native American destruction. This is supposedly progress. Here it is. I'll skip ahead here. Take a look at this. Here you have the pioneer cutting a tree down. This is removing the wilderness. And then the next scene is a story of a Native American family, a so-called chief, with his head in his hands, desperately sorrowful that he's losing. I have endeavored to concentrate all the despair and profound grief resulting from the conviction of the white man's triumph, said the Thomas Crawford, the man who sculpted this. The Indian, the dying chief, contemplating the progress of civilization, an earlier statue, pretty much exactly the same as the one that's on our Capitol. Then we have a mother and child looking to their own deaths. And then finally, a fresh grave. A celebration, again, of genocide, sitting right on our Capitol. To bring us back to the very beginning of this lecture, this is what people are talking about when they say we need to inject some historical accuracy about race and racism in American history. They're not kidding around. They're not making it up when they say that race and racism are intimately intertwined with all the good things that happen in American history. That unless we come to grips with the story of race and racism throughout our past, then we're not going to understand our present at all. We all need to engage in a kind of recovery of that memory, even if that memory is not exactly a pretty thing for the United States. It sure doesn't work for that story of heritage that I was talking about. But I think we're adults enough to come to grips with our actual history. And I think we do a real disservice when we say that we need to pass laws to forbid schools, K-12 schools, from teaching this stuff. It only reinforces that very racism that they say is over. So that's my little bit of a plea, my editorial plea here at the end, that I think is a really important thing to really get to. And I'm wondering if there's no more questions. I think that's the end for me, 3 minutes early. Wow.
All right. Thank you again so much, Paul, for coming back and doing this so that we could get it recorded. We really appreciate it. And we will be contacting everyone probably in January with information about the next seminar coming up at the end of January with Matt Watson with more on critical race theory. Everybody have a good afternoon. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it, y'all. This was really, I love what you're doing. Thanks for organizing it.
Thank you.
See ya. And then we say the hi sign when we leave.